The orange cat brought flowers to the same window every day, until the woman behind it finally smiled. The grandfather clock in the hall ticked with a measured, deliberate rhythm, each tick a tiny hammer blow against the silence of Eleanor's house. It was a silence so profound, so complete, that it had become a physical presence, a heavy blanket smothering every corner of her life. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that pierced the drawn curtains, illuminating the faded floral patterns of the wallpaper and the worn fabric of her armchair. Eleanor sat motionless, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the white expanse of snow that covered her garden. It had been a year since George had gone. A year since the laughter and the scent of baking bread had vanished from the house, replaced by this oppressive, all-consuming quiet. A year since she had truly lived, instead of simply existing, moving through the motions of her days like a ghost in her own home. The house itself was a repository of memories, each object a painful reminder of what she had lost. The chipped ceramic teapot on the shelf, the one they'd bought on their honeymoon in Vermont, the framed photographs on the mantelpiece, capturing moments of joy and laughter that now seemed like scenes from a distant, almost forgotten life. The worn gardening gloves still lying by the back door, caked with the dried mud of George's last planting. Eleanor hadn't touched the garden since he died. The rose bushes, his pride and joy, were now tangled and overgrown, their branches skeletal against the winter sky. The bird feeder, which he had diligently filled every morning, hung empty and neglected. She couldn't bear to tend to them, to face the empty space where he should have been. His hands busy with the soil, his voice humming a tuneless melody. Her days followed a rigid, unchanging pattern. Wake, eat a tasteless breakfast, sit in her armchair by the window, stare at the snow, remember, grieve. The weekly grocery delivery was her only contact with the outside world, a brief, impersonal exchange that barely registered. She had stopped answering the phone, the cheerful voices of friends and neighbors a jarring intrusion into her self-imposed solitude. It was on one of these indistinguishable days, sometime in the bleak midwinter, that she first noticed the cat. A fleeting glimpse, a flicker of orange against the stark white canvas of the snow-covered lawn. She dismissed it, at first, as a trick of the light, a phantom conjured by her lonely mind. But then, she saw it again, and again. Each morning, at roughly the same time, the orange cat would appear at the edge of her property, near the old oak tree that stood sentinel at the corner of the yard. It would pause there, a small, vibrant splash of color against the monochrome landscape, as if assessing the situation. Then, with a swift, fluid movement, it would dart across the lawn to the window where Eleanor sat. And there, on the windowsill, it would leave a single flower. The first one was a dandelion, its yellow head already withered and drooping, a pathetic yet strangely poignant offering. Eleanor barely noticed it. She was too numb, too consumed by her grief, to register such a small, insignificant detail. The next day, it was a sprig of something purple, a tiny, crushed wildflower she couldn't identify. It lay on the windowsill, a fragile splash of color against the dull gray wood. She saw it, this time, but it barely penetrated the fog of her sadness. But the cat persisted. Day after day, it appeared, a silent, orange sentinel, delivering its floral tribute with unwavering dedication. A broken crocus, its petals torn and bruised. A single, perfect snowdrop, its white bell drooping delicately. A sprig of chickweed, its tiny white flowers almost invisible against the snow. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the cat's persistence began to chip away at Eleanor's apathy. It was the regularity of it, the unwavering consistency, that finally pierced the thick armor of her grief. It was something happening, something outside the monotonous, predictable rhythm of her days. She found herself looking at the clock, unconsciously anticipating the cat's arrival. She'd catch herself glancing out the window, searching for that flash of orange fur. The silence of the house was still there, still heavy, but it was no longer absolute. It was punctuated by the expectation of the cat, by the tiny, almost imperceptible shift in her own internal landscape. She wasn't talking to the cat yet. Not aloud, anyway. But in the quiet recesses of her mind, a dialogue had begun. "Where do you come from, cat?" She'd wonder, her gaze following the empty space where the cat had been. "Why do you bring me these flowers?" The flowers themselves were a mystery. They were so small, so insignificant, yet they held a strange power. They were reminders of a world that existed beyond her grief. A world of color and life and growth. A world that George had loved. She picked up the latest offering, a tiny, blue flower with delicate, fringed petals. She didn't know its name, but it sparked a faint, flickering memory. George had shown her a flower like this, once, on a walk in the woods. He'd told her its name, a whimsical, old-fashioned name she couldn't quite recall. The memory brought a sharp pang of sadness, but it was different, somehow, from the dull, aching grief she had grown accustomed to. It was a sadness tinged with something else, a faint, almost forgotten sweetness. Eleanor looked out the window again, her gaze sweeping the empty yard. The cat was gone, vanished as quickly and silently as it had appeared. But it would be back. She knew it. And for the first time in a long time, Eleanor felt a flicker of anticipation. A tiny spark of something other than sorrow. She was waiting. The waiting became a ritual. Eleanor, a woman who had shunned routine and retreated from the world, now found herself anchored by the daily expectation of the orange cat's visit. It was a small thing, an almost insignificant event in the grand scheme of things, but it was something. It was a thread connecting her to the outside world, a fragile lifeline in the vast ocean of her grief. She started talking to him. Not at first, not out loud. At first, it was just a murmur, a silent conversation held within the confines of her mind. "Good morning, cat," she'd whisper, her breath fogging the cold glass of the window pane. "What have you brought me today?" But gradually, as the days turned into weeks, her voice grew stronger, bolder. The silence of the house, once a suffocating presence, began to feel less oppressive, less absolute. It was punctuated by her whispers, by the soft rustle of the curtains as she moved to the window, by the faint creak of the floorboards as she shifted in her chair. "Where do you find these flowers, I wonder?" she'd ask, examining a delicate, white flower with tiny, star-shaped petals. "It's still so cold outside. Are they from someone's garden?" The cat, of course, never answered. He'd simply deposit his floral offering on the windowsill, then retreat a few steps, his amber eyes fixed on Eleanor. He never seemed afraid, but he never came close enough to touch. He maintained a respectful distance, a silent observer of her slow, tentative reemergence. The flowers became her focus, her connection to a world beyond her grief. She started keeping them, carefully pressing them between the pages of an old, leather-bound book of poetry that George had given her. It was a book filled with his handwritten notes, his underlined passages, his pressed flowers from their early years together. The new flowers, Sunny's flowers, became a continuation of that shared history, a tangible link to the past and a fragile bridge to the future. She'd spend hours poring over the pressed flowers, trying to identify them. She found an old wildflower guide, its pages yellowed and brittle with age, tucked away on a bookshelf. Some she recognized: dandelions, violets, clover, their common names familiar and comforting. Others were mysteries, their delicate structures and faded colors hinting at a hidden world she had forgotten. Each flower sparked a memory, a cascade of images and emotions associated with George. The clover reminded her of the summer picnics they used to have in the park, lying on a blanket, searching for four-leaf clovers, his laughter echoing in the warm air. The violets brought back the memory of their first date, a walk in the woods where he'd picked her a tiny bouquet, his eyes shy but filled with a love that would last a lifetime. One day, Sunny brought a sprig of lily of the valley. Its tiny, bell-shaped flowers, intensely fragrant, were a powerful trigger. Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. George had loved lily of the valley. He'd said their scent reminded him of her, of her perfume, of the day they'd met. Tears streamed down Eleanor's face, hot and heavy. The memories flooded back, so vivid, so real. She could almost feel his hand in hers, his breath on her cheek. The pain of his absence was almost unbearable, but beneath the pain, there was a flicker of something else, a gratitude for the love they had shared, a recognition that the memories, though painful, were also precious. She began to leave small offerings for Sunny. A saucer of milk, carefully placed on the windowsill. A small piece of cooked chicken, left over from her meager dinner. A tiny bowl of water. It was a way of saying thank you, a way of acknowledging his presence, his silent companionship. At first, Sunny was hesitant. He'd approach the offerings cautiously, sniffing the air, his body tense and alert. But gradually, he began to trust her. He'd lap up the milk, devour the chicken, drink from the bowl of water. He'd still maintain his distance, but there was a subtle shift in his demeanor, a softening of his gaze, a faint purr that vibrated through his small body. One morning, as Eleanor was watching Sunny lap up the milk, she noticed the collar. It was old and faded, almost the same color as his fur, and she hadn't really seen it before. There was a tag attached, but it was so worn and dirty that she couldn't make out anything written on it. "Come here, kitty," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of hope and apprehension. "Let me see your tag." Sunny paused, his tongue mid-lick. He looked at Eleanor, his amber eyes seeming to study her, to assess her intentions. He took a step back, then another. He wasn't running away, but he wasn't coming closer either. Eleanor sighed. She knew she couldn't force him. She had to earn his trust, to prove to him that she was a friend, not a threat. That day, Sunny brought a single, perfect yellow rose. It was clearly not a wildflower. It must have come from someone's garden. The rose was a vibrant, sunny yellow, the color of joy and friendship. It was the kind of rose George used to give her just because. Eleanor held the rose to her nose, inhaling its sweet, delicate fragrance. The memory of George's smile, his gentle touch, his unwavering love, washed over her. And in that moment, she knew she had to find out where Sunny came from. She had to know who he belonged to. She had to understand why this small, orange cat was bringing her flowers, bringing her back to life. The mystery of the cat, of his flowers, had become a lifeline, a reason to look beyond her grief, a reason to hope. The yellow rose became a turning point, a catalyst. It solidified Eleanor's resolve, pushing her beyond the tentative whispers and cautious interactions towards a decisive action. The mystery of Sunny and his floral gifts had become too compelling, too intertwined with her own healing, to ignore. For several days, she continued her routine, talking to Sunny, offering him treats, and studying the faded tag on his collar. She tried different angles, different lighting, even a magnifying glass she found in a drawer, but the inscription remained stubbornly illegible. The frustration mounted, but so did her determination. Then, one morning, Sunny arrived with something different. It wasn't a single flower, nor a carefully selected sprig. It was a bouquet. It was a magnificent, overflowing, almost comically large bouquet of wildflowers, clutched precariously in his small jaws. It was a riot of color and texture: purple thistles, yellow buttercups, white queen anne's lace, blue chicory, and a dozen other varieties Eleanor couldn't name. It was wild and untamed, a vibrant explosion of life against the still wintry landscape. Sunny struggled to carry it, his small body almost overwhelmed by the sheer abundance of blooms. He stumbled slightly as he approached the window, his head held high, his amber eyes fixed on Eleanor with an intensity that was both startling and deeply moving. Eleanor gasped, her hands flying to her chest. She couldn't believe her eyes. It was the most beautiful, the most extraordinary thing she had seen in months, perhaps years. It was as if Sunny had gathered all the joy and beauty of the world and brought it to her doorstep, a tangible symbol of hope and renewal. The sheer audacity of the bouquet, the effort it must have taken Sunny to collect and carry it, broke through the last remnants of Eleanor's resistance. It was a message clear and undeniable. It was time to act. She fumbled with the window latch, her hands trembling with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The latch, stiff from disuse, finally gave way with a loud click. The window swung inward, a rush of cold, fresh air filling the room, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and the faint, sweet fragrance of the wildflowers. Eleanor then moved to the front door, a door she hadn't opened to the outside world in over a year. The doorknob felt cold and unfamiliar under her hand. She hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest, a wave of anxiety washing over her. This was it. There was no turning back. She took a deep breath, turned the knob, and pulled the door open. The sunlight, even filtered through the bare branches of the trees, seemed incredibly bright after the dimness of the house. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the sounds of birdsong and the distant hum of traffic. It was a sensory overload, a stark contrast to the silent, enclosed world she had inhabited for so long. "Sonny?" she called, her voice a little shaky, a little uncertain. "Come here, kitty." Sonny, startled by the sudden opening of the door, had dropped the bouquet on the windowsill and retreated a few steps. He sat on the snowy lawn, his body tense, his eyes watching her warily. Eleanor took a step outside, then another. The cold air stung her cheeks, but she barely noticed. She was focused on Sonny, on the magnificent bouquet, on the overwhelming feeling that she was crossing a threshold, stepping back into the world. "It's all right, Sonny," she said softly, her voice gaining strength. "I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to thank you." She approached him slowly, cautiously, respecting his space, his apprehension. She spoke to him in a gentle, reassuring tone, her voice a soothing murmur against the backdrop of the morning sounds. Sonny remained wary, but he didn't run. He allowed her to get closer, his gaze unwavering. Eleanor reached out a hand, slowly, tentatively, and stroked his fur. It was soft and warm beneath her fingers. Sonny flinched slightly at her touch, but then, to Eleanor's surprise, he leaned into her hand, a low purr rumbling in his chest. It was a moment of connection, of trust, a silent acknowledgement of the bond that had formed between them. As she petted him, Eleanor got a better look at the collar. The tag was still frustratingly faded, but she could make out a few more letters of the name. "Suni," she murmured. "Sonny, is that your name?" She tried again to decipher the phone number, but it was hopeless. The numbers were too worn, too blurred to read. But she had seen the area code before. It was the area code for Oakhaven, the town where George had worked for so many years. The realization solidified her resolve. She had to go to Oakhaven. She had to find Sonny's owner. She had to understand the meaning of this extraordinary connection, this bridge of blooms that Sonny had built between them. She carefully picked up the bouquet, its weight surprising her. It was a glorious mess of wildflowers, their colors vibrant and alive. She brought it inside, placing it in a large vase filled with water. The flowers filled the room with their fragrance, their beauty, their vibrant energy. Eleanor looked at the bouquet, then out the window at Sonny, who was now sitting patiently on the lawn, watching her. A wave of gratitude washed over her, so intense it brought tears to her eyes. She gathered her purse, her keys, her driver's license items that had lain dormant for months, symbols of a life she had abandoned. She checked her reflection in the mirror, a quick, almost hesitant glance. She saw a woman who looked older, wearier than she remembered, but there was also a new spark in her eyes, a flicker of determination, a hint of the woman she used to be. She got into her car, the old Buick, and started the engine. It sputtered and coughed, protesting after its long period of inactivity, but then it roared to life, a faithful old friend ready for a new adventure. Eleanor backed out of the driveway, her heart pounding, her hands gripping the steering wheel. She was leaving her house, her self-imposed prison, her grief. She was going to Oakhaven. She was going to find the answers she sought. She was going, finally, to follow the path that Sonny, the small orange cat with a heart full of flowers, had laid out for her. The drive to Oakhaven was more than just a journey through miles of Midwestern landscape. It was a journey through Eleanor's own internal landscape, a gradual thawing of the emotional ice that had encased her for so long. As the familiar highway unwound before her, she felt a mixture of trepidation and exhilaration, a sense of re-entering a world she had almost forgotten. The winter landscape, initially stark and barren, began to show subtle signs of impending spring. Patches of brown earth peeked through the melting snow, and the skeletal branches of the trees were tinged with the faint, hopeful green of new buds. The air, crisp and cold, carried the scent of damp earth and the distant promise of blossoms. Eleanor rolled down the window, letting the wind rush through her hair, feeling the sting of the cold air on her cheeks. It was invigorating, a sensory awakening after the stale, confined air of her house. She listened to the sounds of the road, the hum of the tires, the whoosh of passing cars, the occasional cry of a hawk circling overhead. It was a symphony of life, a stark contrast to the silence she had grown accustomed to. She passed through small towns, their names evoking a sense of nostalgia and familiarity: Maplewood, Harmony Creek, Oak Hill. She saw children playing in schoolyards, farmers tending their fields, families gathered on front porches. It was a reminder of the ordinary, everyday rhythms of life, a life she had temporarily withdrawn from. The drive, which she had anticipated with such anxiety, proved to be surprisingly therapeutic. The act of moving, of physically leaving her house and her grief behind, had a profound effect on her. She felt a sense of purpose, a renewed connection to the world, a glimmer of hope that had been absent for so long. When she arrived in Oak Haven, the town square, with its historic courthouse and quaint shops, sparked a flicker of recognition. She remembered coming here with George years ago, when he still worked at the factory on the outskirts of town. They used to have lunch at a small diner, now probably long gone, and stroll through the park, admiring the flower beds. Her first stop was the Oak Haven Public Library. She reasoned that the librarians would be the most likely source of information about the town's residents, past and present. She parked the Buick in front of the library, a stately brick building with tall windows and a welcoming atmosphere. Inside, the library was quiet and peaceful, the air filled with the comforting scent of old books and paper. Eleanor approached the front desk, where a librarian with silver hair and a kind smile greeted her. "Can I help you?" the librarian asked, her voice soft and welcoming. Eleanor hesitated for a moment, feeling a bit foolish explaining her unusual quest. But she took a deep breath and began her story, recounting the tale of the orange cat, the daily deliveries of flowers, the faded tag, and the partial name and area code. The librarian, whose name was Mrs. Peterson, listened patiently, her expression one of genuine interest. She didn't dismiss Eleanor's story as the ramblings of a lonely old woman. Instead, she treated it with respect and a genuine desire to help. "That's quite a story, Mrs. Peterson said, when Eleanor had finished. "Let's see what we can find." Mrs. Peterson consulted an old phone book and a town directory, her fingers tracing the columns of names and addresses. She spent several minutes searching, her brow furrowed in concentration. Eleanor waited, her heart pounding with anticipation, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Finally, Mrs. Peterson looked up, a smile spreading across her face. "I think I might have something," she said. "There was a family named Thompson living on Elm Street about 20 years ago. The husband, Robert Thompson, worked at the factory with your husband, I believe." Eleanor's memory stirred. Thompson, yes. She vaguely remembered George mentioning a colleague named Thompson. "They divorced," Mrs. Peterson continued. "He moved away, but his ex-wife, Margaret, still lives at the same address. At least, she did a few years ago, according to our records." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. "Do you have the address?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Mrs. Peterson wrote down the address on a slip of paper. "It's 12 Elm Street," she said. "It's an older house, on the edge of town. You can't miss it. It has a big, overgrown garden." Eleanor thanked Mrs. Peterson profusely, feeling a surge of gratitude for her kindness and helpfulness. She left the library, clutching the slip of paper in her hand, her mind racing with possibilities. The drive to Elm Street was short, but it felt like an eternity. Eleanor's thoughts were a jumble of anticipation, apprehension, and a strange sense of inevitability. What would she say to this Margaret Thompson? How would she explain the bizarre circumstances that had brought her to her doorstep? She found 12 Elm Street easily. It was just as Mrs. Peterson had described. An older house, 2 stories, with peeling paint and a slightly neglected air. But the garden, despite being overgrown and untamed, was a riot of color, even in early spring. There were daffodils and tulips, hyacinths and crocuses, and a profusion of other blooms she couldn't identify. It was a garden that spoke of a love for flowers, a love that resonated deeply with Eleanor. Eleanor parked the car, took a deep breath, and walked up the cracked sidewalk to the front door. She hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over the doorbell. Then, summoning all her courage, she pressed the button. She heard the chimes echoing inside the house, followed by the sound of footsteps. The door opened, and a woman stood before her. She was in her late 60s, Eleanor guessed, with short, graying hair and a kind, but slightly wary expression. She was wearing a faded floral dress and an apron, as if she had been in the middle of baking or gardening. "Can I help you?" the woman asked, her voice a bit hesitant. Eleanor took another deep breath. "Hello," she said. "My name is Eleanor. I believe your cat has been bringing me flowers." The surprise, the dawning in the other woman's eyes. This was the start of the next chapter. This was where the mystery started to resolve itself, where the solitary journey began to transform into a shared experience. Margaret's initial reaction was, understandably, one of stunned silence. Her eyes widened, her mouth forming a small O of surprise. She looked from Eleanor to the street, as if expecting to see the orange cat perched on the hood of Eleanor's car, a floral bouquet dangling from his mouth. "My cat," she finally managed to say, her voice a mixture of confusion and disbelief. "Bringing you flowers?" Eleanor nodded, feeling a blush rise to her cheeks. She knew how improbable it sounded, how it bordered on the fantastical. She quickly recounted the story, starting with the first withered dandelion and ending with the magnificent bouquet that had finally spurred her to action. She emphasized Sonny's consistency, his unwavering dedication, the faded tag on his collar, and the Oak Haven area code. As Eleanor spoke, Margaret's expression underwent a gradual transformation. The initial disbelief slowly melted away, replaced by a dawning understanding, a flicker of recognition, and finally, a soft, knowing smile. "Sonny," she murmured almost to herself. "It has to be Sonny." She stepped aside, gesturing for Eleanor to enter. "Please come in," she said, her voice warmer now, tinged with a hint of wonder. "This is swell. This is quite extraordinary." The interior of Margaret's house was a mirror image of Eleanor's own, in many ways a cozy, lived-in space filled with the accumulated treasures of a long life. There were framed photographs on the walls, crocheted throws on the furniture, and the faint, comforting scent of baking spices in the air. It felt familiar, welcoming, a space where memories were cherished. Margaret led Eleanor into a small, sun-drenched living room. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, a scene reminiscent of Eleanor's own home. But unlike Eleanor's house, this one felt alive. There was a sense of warmth, of activity, of a life still being fully lived. "Please sit down," Margaret said, gesturing to a comfortable armchair. "I'll make us some tea." As Margaret busied herself in the kitchen, Eleanor looked around the room, her eyes drawn to the photographs. Many of them were of a man, a younger version of George, but with a slightly different spark in his eyes, a more carefree demeanor. There were also pictures of a younger Margaret, laughing, her arm around George's waist, a vibrant, happy couple. Margaret returned with a tray bearing a teapot, 2 cups, and a plate of homemade cookies. She poured the tea, her movements graceful and practiced. "So," Margaret said, settling into the opposite armchair, "you're Eleanor." George's wife. Eleanor nodded, feeling a slight pang of awkwardness, a sense of intruding on a past she hadn't been a part of. His widow, actually, she corrected gently. He passed away a year ago. I'm so sorry, Margaret said, her voice filled with genuine sympathy. George was a good man. We were married a long time ago, very young. It didn't last, but we remained friends, in a way. He spoke of you often, with such love and admiration. Eleanor felt a lump form in her throat. He mentioned you, too. Said you were both very young. Margaret smiled, a wistful, slightly melancholic smile. We were different people then. But Sonny was a constant. She pointed towards the window, and Eleanor saw him. Sonny was sitting on the porch railing, watching them through the glass, his orange fur glowing in the sunlight. It was him without a doubt. The same small, determined cat who had single-handedly pulled her out of the depths of her grief. Sonny was George's cat, from when we were married, Margaret explained. He's quite old now, 15 at least. After George and I separated, Sonny stayed with me. He's always been an independent spirit, a wanderer. He loves to explore, and he adores flowers, especially wildflowers. He used to bring them to George all the time, little offerings of love. Eleanor listened, mesmerized, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place. The flowers, the cat's persistence, the connection to Oakhaven, it all made sense now. After George died, Margaret continued, her voice softening, Sonny started bringing me flowers. It was comforting in a strange way, a reminder of him, of our shared past. She paused, taking a sip of her tea. But then, a few months ago, he started disappearing for longer stretches. I worried, of course, but he always came back. I just assumed he was exploring further afield. She looked at Eleanor, her eyes filled with a mixture of wonder and understanding. It seems he found you. Somehow, he found his way to you, to Georgia Tio, the woman George loved. And he started bringing you flowers, too. Eleanor felt tears welling up again, tears of grief, of gratitude, of awe at the extraordinary loyalty and intuition of this small, orange cat. He had bridged the gap between two women who had both loved the same man, connecting them through a shared love of flowers, a shared memory of George. Eleanor and Margaret spent the rest of the afternoon talking, sharing stories about George, about their lives, about the unexpected ways in which love and loss can shape us. They discovered common interests, a shared sense of humor, and a mutual respect that transcended their unusual circumstances. It was as if Sonny, sitting quietly between them, had woven an invisible thread, connecting their hearts, their stories, their lives. He was the silent guardian, the faithful companion, the bridge of blooms. Time passed, and soon, a schedule and a routine formed between the two women and Sonny. Eleanor, back in her own home, felt a profound shift. The silence was no longer oppressive, the house no longer a museum of grief. She had a friend, a connection, a reason to leave the house, a reason to smile. She started gardening again, tending to the rose bushes George had loved, her hands finding solace in the soil. Sonny continued his visits, dividing his time between Eleanor and Margaret, a furry ambassador of friendship. Sometimes he'd bring flowers, sometimes he'd simply sit on the windowsill, a silent, comforting presence. Eleanor would talk to him, sharing her thoughts, her memories, her hopes for the future. The story ends with Eleanor sitting in her armchair, the sunlight streaming through the window, illuminating the vase of wildflowers Sonny had brought that morning. She's no longer alone. She has Margaret, she has Sonny, and she has the enduring memory of George, a memory that is no longer solely defined by grief, but also by love, by connection, and by the unexpected beauty that can bloom even in the most desolate of landscapes. The silence is still there, but it's a different kind of silence now, a peaceful, contented silence, filled with the quiet hum of life, of friendship, and of the enduring love of a small, orange cat.
For a year, the old orange cat waited outside the hospital. But when they finally let him in, no one expected what would happen in room 512. St. Jude's Mercy Hospital stood as a venerable institution in the heart of Philadelphia, its older wings built from imposing granite and brick, softened slightly by decades of ivy. Newer glass and steel additions reflected the bustling city around it. But near the main entrance of the original building, time seemed to move a little slower. It was here, just beyond the heavy oak doors and the perpetually revolving glass entrance, that the orange cat maintained his vigil. No one quite knew when he first appeared. He seemed to simply materialize one day, a splash of warm color against the cool gray paving stones. He wasn't a typical stray, not skittish or desperate. He didn't weave between the legs of visitors, begging for scraps, nor did he engage in territorial disputes with the city pigeons. He simply lay, usually curled near a large stone planter filled with seasonal flowers, his body positioned just so, his gaze fixed unwaveringly upwards. He watched one specific window on the 5th floor, the top floor of the oldest wing, a section primarily dedicated to long-term care and palliative services. Day after day, week after week, month after month, he was there. Through the sweltering humidity of a Philadelphia summer where the pavement radiated heat and pedestrians hurried from one air-conditioned space to another, he lay panting softly, eyes half-lidded but still directed towards that window. When autumn arrived, painting the city in hues of red and gold, he curled tighter against the chill, occasionally retreating beneath the broad leaves of the planter's shrubs during sudden showers, only to reappear, damp but resolute, once the rain stopped. Winter brought biting winds whistling down the avenues and blankets of snow that muffled the city's roar. Nurses arriving for early shifts would find him dusted with white, a small, determined figure huddled against the stone, still watching. Spring saw the return of fragile sunshine and blooming tulips in the planter, and still the orange cat remained, a constant, silent presence. The hospital staff grew accustomed to him. Some, moved by his quiet persistence, left out small dishes of food or water near the planter, offerings he would accept gratefully, but without fuss, before resuming his watch. Security guards knew him, initially trying to shoo him away before realizing the futility and perhaps the quiet injustice of disturbing his vigil. They nicknamed him Captain, partly for his ginger coloring, partly for the steadfast way he seemed to be guarding his post. Visitors often commented on him, some with pity, others with curiosity. "Poor thing must be lost," they'd murmur, or "wonder what he's looking at." Dr. Robert Miller, a cardiologist with nearly 30 years of service at St. Jude's, was one of the few who began to sense something more than just a stray cat's strange habit. Dr. Miller was a man of routine and quiet observation, traits honed by decades of listening to heartbeats and deciphering the subtle clues of the human body. He noticed things others missed: the slight tremor in a patient's hand, the fleeting shadow of fear in their eyes, the way hope could change the rhythm of a breath. And he noticed Captain. He noticed the cat wasn't young. There was a slight stiffness in his movements, a cloudiness creeping into the vibrant green of his eyes. His ginger coat, though kept reasonably clean, was thinning in patches, and beneath it, Dr. Miller could discern the knobs of his spine more clearly than before. This cat had seen many seasons, perhaps 15 or more. He also noticed the intensity of the cat's focus. It wasn't a casual gaze. It was a deep, unwavering concentration, directed solely at that fifth-floor window, as if waiting for a sign, a familiar face, a light to switch on or off. Dr. Miller's route often took him past the main entrance several times a day, going between the main hospital and the cardiac wing. He started making a point of looking for Captain, noting his position, the angle of his gaze. He felt a growing unease, a sense of mystery that tugged at the edges of his pragmatic medical mind. Why this spot? Why this window? And why the air of quiet desperation he sometimes thought he saw in the depths of those green eyes, especially as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the hospital entrance. He saw the kindness Captain was shown. Nurse Bethany from Pediatrics often left him leftover chicken from her lunch. Mr. Henderson, the night security guard, had fashioned a small, discreet shelter from a cardboard box, lined with an old blanket tucked behind the planter for the coldest nights. Captain used it, emerging faithfully each morning to resume his watch. He was cared for in a peripheral, communal way, but his fundamental solitude, his relentless focus on that distant window, remained untouched. One blustery March afternoon, Dr. Miller paused near the entrance, watching Captain. The cat was lying flat, paws tucked under his chest, seemingly oblivious to the wind-whipping paper debris down the street. His gaze was locked on the fifth-floor window, now dark against the bruised purple of the late afternoon sky. A light drizzle began to fall, speckling the pavement. Captain didn't flinch. Dr. Miller felt a pang of something akin to sorrow. He was used to dealing with loss and grief within the hospital walls, the human kind. But looking at this small, aging animal, dedicating every moment of its existence to watching an empty window, felt like witnessing a different, purer form of mourning, a loyalty that defied logic and comfort. He looked up at the window himself. Fifth floor, third from the left in the old wing, long-term care. He'd done rounds up there occasionally, consulted on cases. The rooms were simple, functional, holding patients often facing the twilight of their lives. Who had lived in that room? And what connection did they have to this steadfast creature waiting below? The question settled in Dr. Miller's mind, no longer just a passing curiosity, but a puzzle he felt compelled somehow to solve. He needed to understand the reason behind the sentinel's unwavering vigil. The image of Captain, huddled against the stone planter with his gaze fixed upward, stayed with Dr. Miller long after he'd finished his rounds that evening. Driving home through the rain-slick streets of Philadelphia, the rhythmic sweep of the wipers seemed to echo the steady, patient beat of the cat's vigil. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing an important piece of a story, one written not in medical charts, but in the silent language of loyalty and loss. The next morning, under a washed, clean sky, Captain was back in his usual spot. Dr. Miller stopped, ostensibly to admire the newly blooming daffodils in the planter, but really to observe the cat. He noted the way Captain's ears swiveled slightly at the sound of the automatic doors opening, a brief flicker of attention before returning to the fifth-floor window. Hope? Expectation? It was impossible to say, but the intensity was undeniable. Dr. Miller, walked into the hospital, nodding to the familiar faces at the reception desk. Instead of heading straight to the cardiology department, he took the older, slightly creaky elevator up to the 5th floor. The long-term care wing had a different atmosphere than the bustling lower floors, quieter, slower paced, scented with antiseptic and floor polish, but also sometimes with the faint aroma of flowers or talcum powder. He walked down the corridor, his footsteps echoing softly on the linoleum. He counted the doors. 1, 2, 3. Room 512. The door was closed. A small nameplate holder beside it was empty, wiped clean. He stood there for a moment, looking at the closed door, then turned to the window at the end of the corridor, which offered a similar view to the one from inside the room. Overlooking the main entrance courtyard, the stone planter, the street beyond. From here, looking down, he could just make out a small patch of orange fur near the planter. Captain, holding his position, a wave of memory, sudden and clear, washed over Dr. Miller. He had been in this room before, not recently, perhaps a year and a half, maybe 2 years ago. A consultation. An elderly gentleman, quiet, dignified, with intelligent eyes behind thick-lensed glasses. He'd been reading a book, propped up in the standard hospital bed. But what Dr. Miller remembered most vividly was the other occupant of the room. Curled on the worn armchair near the window, basking in a patch of sunlight, had been an orange cat. A handsome fellow, clearly well cared for, with a glossy coat and a calm demeanor. It had blinked slowly at Dr. Miller upon his entrance, but hadn't seemed perturbed by the intrusion. The patient's name came back to him. Blackwood. Silas Blackwood. He'd been admitted for management of severe chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD, complicated by congestive heart failure, a difficult case requiring long-term oxygen therapy and careful monitoring. Dr. Miller had been called in to consult on his cardiac management. He remembered Mr. Blackwood speaking in a soft, slightly breathless voice about his companion. "Captain keeps me honest," he'd said with a wry smile, gesturing towards the cat with the book he held. "Make sure I don't sleep all day. Reminds me when it's time for pills or treats." Having a pet in a long-term care facility was unusual, but St. Jude's had a progressive, though strictly regulated policy for certain residents under specific conditions. If a patient was deemed capable of caring for the animal, or had assistance, if the animal was certified healthy and temperamentally suitable, and crucially, if it provided significant therapeutic benefit, exceptions could be made. Mr. Blackwood, a retired librarian with no family visiting, clearly derived immense comfort from his cat. Captain had become a quiet fixture in room 512, known and loved by the nurses, a furry ambassador of calm on the ward. Dr. Miller recalled seeing the cat often during that period, sometimes sleeping on the bed beside Mr. Blackwood, sometimes sitting on the windowsill watching the world go by, always a silent, comforting presence. The bond between the man and his cat had been palpable, a relationship built on years of quiet companionship. And Mr. Blackwood, Dr. Miller searched his memory. He hadn't seen him on the ward recently. He walked to the nurses' station, a brightly lit hub of activity halfway down the corridor. Nurse Evans, a kind woman with laugh lines around her eyes and decades of experience, was reviewing charts. "Helen," Dr. Miller began, "forgive me for asking. I know my memory isn't what it used to be, but do you recall a patient, Mr. Silas Blackwood? He was in room 512, had severe COPD, and an orange cat?" Nurse Evans looked up, her expression softening with recognition. "Oh, Mr. Blackwood, of course I remember him. And Captain, sweetest man, and that cat was his shadow. Never saw a bond like it." She paused, her smile fading slightly. "He passed away, Doctor, about a year ago now, maybe a little longer. Peaceful, thankfully. Just slipped away in his sleep." She gestured towards room 512. "In there. A year ago." Dr. Miller felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Captain had appeared at the hospital entrance around a year ago. It wasn't a coincidence. The cat wasn't lost. He wasn't waiting for just anyone. He was waiting for Silas Blackwood, waiting for his person to appear at the window or come through the doors, just like he used to when Mr. Blackwood was occasionally allowed short walks in the courtyard garden with his portable oxygen. He looked back towards the empty room, then thought of the small, determined figure waiting patiently below, waiting for someone who would never return. The depth of the cat's loyalty, his unwavering hope, or perhaps just his inability to comprehend the finality of death, struck Dr. Miller with profound force. "The cat," Dr. Miller said slowly. "Captain, he's been living outside the main entrance for the past year." Nurse Evans' eyes widened. "Outside? Good heavens! Is he all right? We all wondered what happened to him after Mr. Blackwood. Well, after. There was no family to take him, you see. We tried contacting some rescue groups, but things were hectic, and somehow—" Her voice trailed off, a hint of regret in her tone. "He's all right," Dr. Miller reassured her, though his heart ached at the thought of the cat's lonely vigil. "The staff leaves food for him. He seems to manage. But Helen, he just lies there day after day, staring up at this window. Room 512. Nurse Evans put a hand to her mouth, her eyes filling with understanding and sorrow. Oh, the poor dear creature, waiting for Silas. The pieces clicked into place, forming a picture far more poignant and heartbreaking than Dr. Miller had initially imagined. This wasn't just a stray cat. This was a devoted companion, engaged in a year-long vigil, clinging to the last place he had known his human, watching the window of the room where their shared life had quietly ended. The sentinel at the gate wasn't guarding the hospital, he was guarding a memory, waiting faithfully for a reunion that could never happen in this world. Dr. Miller felt a renewed sense of responsibility, not just as a doctor, but as a witness to this extraordinary display of devotion. Something he knew had to be done. The revelation that the orange cat, Captain, was Silas Blackwood's devoted companion, patiently waiting for his deceased owner for over a year, spread quickly among the long-serving staff at St. Jude's. Nurses, orderlies, security guards, even some administrators who had known Mr. Blackwood or simply observed the cat's persistent presence shared the story in hushed tones in break rooms and hallways. The narrative shifted from that stray cat to Mr. Blackwood's loyal friend. Pity turned into a deeper, more complex empathy, tinged with awe at the depth of the animal's devotion and a collective sense of regret that he had been left to fend for himself for so long. More food appeared near the planter. Someone brought a thicker, waterproof cushion to put inside the makeshift shelter Mr. Henderson had provided. Nurse Bethany started bringing small toys, a fuzzy mouse, a ball with a bell, though Captain merely sniffed at them politely before returning his gaze to the fifth-floor window. His purpose remained singular, unwavering. Dr. Miller found himself increasingly troubled. Understanding the why behind Captain's vigil only highlighted the tragedy of it. He observed the cat more closely now, noticing the subtle signs of decline he'd previously registered only peripherally. Captain moved more stiffly, especially on colder mornings. His grooming seemed less meticulous, his vibrant coat losing some of its luster despite the improved diet. He slept more, though always with one eye half open, ever watchful. The spark in his green eyes seemed dimmer, clouded by age and perhaps by the sheer exhaustion of his unending wait. How much longer could he keep this up? The unspoken question hung in the air. What should be done about Captain? Leaving him outside, especially with another harsh Philadelphia winter inevitably approaching, felt increasingly cruel now that they understood his story. He wasn't just a stray anymore. He was, in a sense, a former resident, a grieving companion animal left behind. "We can't just leave him out there," Nurse Evans said firmly during an informal chat with Dr. Miller and Sarah Jenkins, the hospital's patient advocate, near the nurses' station one afternoon. "Not after knowing. It doesn't feel right." "I agree," Sarah Jenkins nodded. She was a practical woman, adept at navigating the hospital's bureaucracy. But she also had a kind heart. The problem is, where does he go? Animal shelters are overflowing, and finding a home for an older cat, especially one with such specific needs, attachments, is difficult. "Perhaps one of us could take him," Nurse Evans suggested tentatively, though her expression showed doubt. Many staff members already had pets, lived in apartments with restrictions, or worked long hours. Dr. Miller thought of his own quiet apartment. He traveled occasionally for conferences. It wouldn't be fair to the captain. "He needs stability," he said quietly. "And perhaps familiarity?" Sarah Jenkins had an idea. "What about his records? Mr. Blackwood's records, I mean. You said there was no family Helen, but maybe there was an emergency contact, a friend, someone listed who might have known about Captain, who might be willing." "We checked thoroughly at the time," Nurse Evans sighed, "because of Captain. Silas was very private. No spouse, no children listed. No siblings came forward. His emergency contact was just his landlord from years ago, address long outdated. Social work tried tracing any connections, but he seemed, well, truly alone, except for Captain. This was the fact that struck everyone anew. Silas Blackwood, the quiet man with the kind eyes and the devoted cat, had navigated his final years with only his feline companion for family. Captain wasn't just a pet. He was, in all likelihood, the sole recipient and reflection of Silas's affection, his confidant, his furry heartbeat in the quiet room. And for Captain, Silas had been his entire world, provider, companion, source of safety and love. The knowledge cast Captain's vigil in an even more poignant light. He wasn't just waiting for an owner, he was waiting for his only family, the center of his universe. His persistent watch wasn't just loyalty, It was the desperate clinging of a creature utterly bereft, returning to the last place where his world had been whole. The weight of this solitude, Silas's in life, Captain's in grief, settled heavily on the small group. It galvanized their resolve. "Then we are his family now," Sarah Jenkins declared softly but firmly. "St. Jude's. He belongs here, in a way." An idea began to form, unconventional but rooted in compassion. "He's clearly bonded to this place," Dr. Miller mused, "specifically to room 512. What if we brought him inside, not to rehome him immediately, but to give him comfort, warmth, a safe place to live out his remaining time? Here? In the hospital?" Nurse Evans looked surprised, then thoughtful. "We couldn't keep him on the active wards, of course. Infection control, allergies. But there are administrative offices," Sarah suggested. "Quiet corners. Or perhaps we could make special arrangements, given his age and condition." She looked pointedly at Dr. Miller. Dr. Miller understood her unspoken question. Captain was visibly declining. His vigil, fueled by grief and loyalty, was taking its toll on his aging body. Bringing him inside wouldn't just be an act of kindness. It might be a form of hospice care for the devoted animal. "Let me talk to the administration," Sarah said, already making notes. "I'll frame it as a special case. Therapeutic companion animal of a former long-term patient, now requiring palliative consideration. Emphasize his age, his history with the hospital. We can set up a comfortable space for him somewhere quiet." Over the next few days, Sarah Jenkins worked her quiet magic. She navigated the regulations, appealed to the hospital director's sense of compassion, and secured the necessary permissions. Arrangements were made. A small, rarely used consultation room on the ground floor, filled with soft chairs and quiet afternoon sunlight, was designated as Captain's new residence. Staff volunteered to care for him in shifts, feeding, cleaning, offering quiet companionship. The plan was set. They would wait for a quiet evening after the bustle of visiting hours had subsided. Dr. Miller and Nurse Evans volunteered to be the ones to bring Captain inside, hoping their familiar faces would ease the transition. There was a sense of anticipation, a collective hope that they could finally offer this loyal creature the peace and comfort he deserved after his long, lonely wait. They just hoped Captain would understand that he would accept this offering of sanctuary from the humans who inhabited the building where he had last known happiness. The chosen evening arrived with a gentle quietude, unusual for the normally bustling city hospital. The late shift had settled in, the corridors were hushed, and a soft rain whispered against the windows, washing the city lights into blurry pastels. Dr. Miller met Nurse Evans near the main entrance, both feeling a mixture of hope and trepidation. Mr. Henderson, the night guard, had gently coaxed Captain into a comfortable pet carrier using his favorite salmon treats. The cat hadn't resisted, perhaps too weary, or perhaps sensing the kindness in the familiar hand. He sat quietly in the carrier now, green eyes luminous in the dim light, watching Dr. Miller and Nurse Evans approach. "Ready, Doctor?" Nurse Evans asked softly, her hand resting reassuringly on the carrier's handle. "As I'll ever be," Dr. Miller replied, managing a small smile. "Let's bring him home." Nurse Evans lifted the carrier gently. Captain let out a small questioning meow, but remained calm. They walked through the revolving doors, the familiar hospital scents, antiseptic, floor wax, cafeteria steam, washing over them. Captain sniffed the air inside the carrier, his nose twitching. They bypassed the elevators, opting for the quiet stairwell to avoid startling Captain further. Their footsteps echoed in the enclosed space. Reaching the ground floor corridor that led towards the designated consultation room, Nurse Evans paused. "Doctor," she said hesitantly, "I know the plan was the consultation room, but seeing him here, knowing his story, doesn't it feel right, perhaps, to take him?" She didn't need to finish the sentence. Dr. Miller understood immediately. The consultation room was practical, safe, but room 512 held the memories. It was the place Captain had been watching, waiting for over a year. Perhaps the final step in his journey needed to be there. "It's empty now, isn't it?" Dr. Miller asked. "Yes, cleaned and waiting for the next admission. It's quiet up there tonight." A quick, unspoken agreement passed between them. Compassion overruled logistics. "Let's go," Dr. Miller said. They took the elevator this time, the ascent smooth and silent. Stepping out onto the 5th floor, the familiar quiet of the long-term care wing enveloped them. They walked down the corridor towards room 512. Nurse Evans used her master key to gently unlock the door and pushed it open. The room was dimly lit by the ambient light from the hallway and the city glow filtering through the window. It was clean, sterile, stripped of personal belongings, yet some faint, indefinable essence of its former occupant seemed to linger. The ghost of pipe tobacco Silas sometimes smoked near the open window, the scent of old books, the simple presence of a life lived quietly within these walls. Nurse Evans carried the carrier inside and placed it gently on the floor. Dr. Miller closed the door almost completely, leaving just a crack open. They knelt down, and Nurse Evans unlatched the carrier door. Captain didn't bolt out. He cautiously poked his head out, his whiskers twitching, taking in the sights and smells of the room. He looked around slowly at the empty bed with its tightly tucked white sheets, the standard issue armchair near the window itself, now dark but reflecting the room's interior. His body seemed to tense slightly, a shiver running through his thin frame. He stepped out of the carrier, moving with the stiffness of age, but with a new alertness in his eyes. He walked slowly towards the center of the room, his paws silent on the linoleum. He sniffed the base of the metal bed frame, then the leg of the armchair. He paused beneath the window, looking out for a moment at the rain-streaked darkness below. The view he had only ever seen from the ground, looking up. Then he turned towards the bed. He looked at it for a long moment, as if gathering his strength. With a visible effort, he bunched his old muscles and leaped, landing softly on the mattress. He stood there, swaying slightly, looking around the room one last time. He walked towards the pillows, sniffing the clean, starched linen. He let out a sound, not quite a meow, more of a soft, breathy sigh, a whimper that seemed to contain echoes of confusion, recognition, and immense weariness. It was a sound that tugged sharply at the hearts of the two humans watching in silence. Then, as if finally understanding, or perhaps simply accepting, Captain began to circle, just as he must have done countless times when Silas was there. He pawed gently at the blanket, turned around twice, and then curled into a tight ball near the head of the bed, right where Silas's shoulder would have been. He tucked his nose under his tail, his body relaxing completely. Another soft sigh escaped him, this one sounding like release. His eyes drifted closed. Dr. Miller and Nurse Evans watched, hardly daring to breathe. They expected him to sleep, to finally rest in a warm, safe place imbued with the faint echoes of his beloved human. They waited. The minutes ticked by. Captain didn't stir. His breathing, which had been shallow, seemed to grow even fainter, almost imperceptible. Dr. Miller, his medical instincts kicking in, moved silently closer to the bed. He reached out a gentle hand, hesitated, then lightly touched Captain's side. There was no response, no flinch, no purr, no stirring. The slight rise and fall of his ribs had ceased. Captain was still. Nurse Evans gasped softly, tears welling in her eyes. Dr. Miller felt a profound wave of sorrow mixed with a strange sense of peace. Captain hadn't been brought inside for hospice care in the consultation room. He had completed his journey. His year-long vigil hadn't just been about waiting. It had been about returning. He had needed to come back to this room, to this bed, to the very heart of his shared world with Silas. He had waited, endured, held on through seasons of hardship and loneliness, driven by a loyalty that defied human understanding. And now, having finally reached his destination, having found his way back to the place where love had resided, he could finally let go. His mission was complete. He was reunited in spirit, if not in body, with the one he had never forgotten. Dr. Miller gently stroked the soft, still warm fur. "He's at peace, Helen," he murmured, his own voice thick with emotion. "He made it home." They stood there for a long time in the quiet room, witnesses to the end of an extraordinary love story. The rain continued to fall outside, washing the city clean, while inside St. Jude's Mercy Hospital, a small orange cat, the steadfast sentinel, had finally found his rest, curled forever in the heart of his memory, loyal unto death, and perhaps even beyond. The legend of Captain, the cat who waited, would become a quiet part of the hospital's history, a poignant reminder of a bond that even time and loss could not break.